Tilde. Just something short and fun to think about today. Most of you have probably seen articles being written around the place, or videos, or heard it on the news, or something like that, people making this conflation between so-called Islamophobia and racism. And I say so-called Islamophobia because apparently any criticism of Islam, no matter how legitimate, is always classed as a phobia for some bizarre reason. And indeed, any mention of that religion being involved in any sort of violent attack, once again, often considered a phobia when it's merely an observation of fact. And then of course you get the questions of how much of a problem does something have to be before not liking it becomes a completely rational response. But that's another topic for another time. Today I want to give a little consideration to those people who say, oh, you don't like Islam, therefore you're a racist, or some other nonsense like that. Most of the time this point is refuted by the simple and completely correct observation that Islam is not a race. Therefore, not liking the idea, the concept that is Islam, cannot in any way be conflated to a particular racial group or genetic population. And this point, this argument, is completely sound. An idea is not a person or a people, and therefore this conflation is unfounded. Unless you wanted to go into super duper mad abstract philosophy land where you start having to consider the idea that, well, if there's no people around to think an idea, can an idea really exist, and is therefore an idea merely a manifestation of something that actually is human and is therefore intrinsically linked to them in some capacity? And again, this is something not really worth considering because actually in the scheme of life it doesn't matter at all. But when it comes to this Islamophobia equals racism nonsense, I think it might be useful for some people to understand where exactly that argument comes from, no matter how flawed it is. And this is something which I've looked up from many places around and about the internet. It comes up in comment sections, in videos, in articles, and the general premise seems to stem from one specific idea. Now obviously this example won't be the case in every situation because this is a kind of conglomerate image, something which I've built up from numerous sources, but this seems to be the critical thread that goes through all of them. And that thread is basically thought policing, or the idea that the person making the claim or observation of racism knows what's going on in your head better than you do. And the logic goes something like this. Most people who are in the religion of Islam are brown. This is because of the geographical areas where Islam is most predominant, being the Middle East, where most people are brown-skinned Arabs. And therefore, the criticism of Islam is actually a masked form of racism, or a masked form of white supremacy. That the criticism of Islam is basically a Trojan horse method by which to attack brown people. That the criticism of Islam might not actually be valid, or might not actually be a genuine concern, or an actual observation, but it's basically just an excuse to say something negative about people who aren't white. And that is the string of logic, or so-called logic or reasoning, that these people use to say that Islamophobia equals racism. It's basically leaping into the mind of the person giving the criticism and asserting their motive based on what they've said. And of course they pick the least charitable and most offensive motivation that they can find. Because of course you couldn't be criticizing Islam in the same way that you were to criticize Christianity or Judaism for logical inconsistencies, contradictions in their holy books, potential misrepresentations or misunderstandings of scripture leading to behavior which is forbidden, and numerous other completely legitimate criticisms that can be leveled at any religion, or indeed any sort of moral or social structure outside of religion. That is the most common thread which I see running through these criticism of religion equals racism examples. It's the idea that you are criticizing this thing exclusively because of the demographics of people who believe that thing, and you're doing it purely because that demographic is different from your demographic. Now obviously, this is complete nonsense. There is a myriad of reasons to disagree with something like Islam, not only on theological grounds, but on moral grounds, social grounds, legal grounds. There's plenty of things that could be said about it, and those things could be said about it regardless of how many people or what kind of people are practicing that religion. I just find it quite interesting, and on some levels absolutely disgusting, that there are people out there who will assert and try to force a simple disagreement of ideas into some sort of racial battle, turning a difference of opinion necessarily into some sort of "you just hate the people" angle, which is something which is simply not true for a lot of people who are criticizing the ideas. And even if there is a dislike of the people in particular, then the question has to be asked, is it wrong to dislike people who engage in violent behaviour? Is it wrong to dislike people who, by your own moral standards, infringe on the rights of others? Because I tend to find that the people making the Islamophobia equals racism argument, they tend to have no problem with disliking people, in many instances going so far as to actively hate people who don't toe their particular political line, in some cases enacting violence or supporting the enacting of violence against those people. Well, I guess if some people didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all. Anyway, just something interesting to consider. It's always nice to know from whence a particular argument comes, even if it's not going to change the answer that you give, because no matter how much you say it, Islam is not a race. And the criticisms of an idea does not necessitate racial prejudice or hatred, nor does that criticism have to be camouflage for racial prejudice or hatred.